courtroom was filled with murmurs and tense silence as people filed into their seats. Reporters tapped their pens on notepads, photographers were already warned not to use flash, and every person inside felt that something unusual was about to unfold. The case at hand wasn't just any custody battle, it had gripped the local media and stirred debate across the state. A father fighting for full custody, a mother claiming emotional abuse, but the center of the storm was a quiet, fragile girl named Leila. She was only 8 years old, but her presence in the courtroom was weighty. She entered holding a small, well-behaved black Labrador retriever by a blue leash. The dog, Shadow, wore a vest-marked certified trauma response service dog. His steps were slow and careful, mirroring the seriousness of the moment. When they reached the witness seat, Leila sat down quietly, Shadow curled at her feet, head resting gently on her shoes. The judge, a stern but respected figure named Judge Harrow, leaned forward and peered over his glasses. He tapped his gavel once. Court is now in session, he announced. On one side of the courtroom sat Leila's father, tall, clean-cut, with eyes that never quite met anyone else's. His legal team was aggressive, confident, and determined to dismantle the mother's credibility. On the other side, Leila's mother sat with her hands clenched in her lap, barely able to look up. Her lawyer, more cautious, had emphasized the trauma Leila had endured, but had no concrete evidence of physical harm. The problem was, Leila hadn't spoken a word, not to social services, not to psychologists, not even to her own mother. Since the day she left her father's house, she had been completely mute. Professionals believed she might be selectively mute due to trauma, or simply unwilling to speak about the past. Her silence left the court with little more than speculation. The judge turned his gaze to Leila. "Miss Leila," he said softly, trying not to intimidate her, "can you tell us anything about how you feel? Do you feel safe with your father?" Leila didn't move. She didn't blink, but her hand gently reached down to Shadow's head and rested there. Her fingers curled slightly, not a random movement, but a deliberate motion. Shadow's ears perked up. Most people didn't notice the signal, but Shadow did. He stood up slowly, alert. The judge raised his eyebrows. "Is the dog all right?" Leila didn't reply. Shadow took one careful step forward, sniff in the air, then another. The dog's tail stiffened. His gaze locked on Leila's father. He began to growl. The entire courtroom fell silent. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't violent, but it was purposeful. Shadow, who had been praised in countless sessions for his calm, composed demeanor, was growling, low, steady, and directed toward the defendant. Leila's father shifted in his chair and cleared his throat. "What is this?" he said with a forced laugh. "Is this supposed to mean something?" Leila's mother gasped. Her lawyer stood up instinctively. The judge raised his hand and motioned for everyone to stay seated. Shadow took another step forward, then stopped. He stared straight at the man. "Miss Leila," the judge said slowly, "did you tell him to do that?" No reply, but Leila reached her hand toward the dog again and gave a second, very subtle hand signal, this time near her shoulder. Shadow responded instantly. He let out a sharp, loud bark. The sound jolted everyone. The bailiff instinctively moved forward, unsure whether to restrain the dog or remove the witness, but the judge waved him back. "What just happened?" Judge Harrow demanded. "What was that signal?" Leila remained frozen. Her eyes looked only at Shadow. The judge turned toward the lawyers. "Did anyone here know that the child could communicate with the dog?" Leila's mother's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we were informed the dog was trained in emotional support and trauma response, but we weren't told about specific signals." The room felt colder now, more aware. Every person inside was wondering the same thing. Was this little girl using the dog to tell the truth without speaking? The judge's gavel came down again, this time with force. "Court is in recess," he declared. "Everyone out except the child, her legal representatives, and the animal behavior specialists get one here immediately." The room erupted in chatter as people began to move. Reporters scribbled frantically. The father looked shaken for the first time. Leila hadn't said a word, but the look in her eyes, the dog's reaction, and the stillness in the courtroom all pointed to a deeper truth. The judge leaned back in his chair and stared at the little girl sitting silently beside her loyal companion. She wasn't broken. She wasn't confused. She was trying to say something. And thanks to Shadow, the court was finally starting to hear it. The courtroom emptied slowly, still echoing from Shadow's bark. Whispers floated around like dust in sunlight, but inside Judge Harrow's chamber, the atmosphere was heavy and focused. Leela sat quietly with Shadow at her side, one hand resting firmly on his neck. Her mother sat nearby, eyes full of concern and questions. No one quite understood what had just happened, but everyone agreed it meant something. The judge removed his robe and stepped down from the bench, a rare gesture that told the room he wanted clarity more than formality. He looked at Leela first, then knelt slightly, lowering himself to her level. "Leela," he said gently, "I saw you give Shadow a signal. Was that something you were taught?" She didn't speak. Her eyes flicked up, briefly, but then returned to the dog. Shadow's ears twitched, his body calm again. The judge wasn't angry. He was curious and concerned. "We're going to bring someone in," he said softly. "Someone who understands dogs like Shadow. Is that okay?" Still, Leela remained quiet, but she didn't seem afraid. She gave the judge the smallest nod, so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching carefully. Moments later, a woman entered the room with a clipboard and a dog whistle hanging around her neck. She introduced herself as Dr. Elise Warner, a canine behavioral expert who specialized in trauma response animals. "I reviewed Shadow's certification records when he was first registered with the court," she said as she knelt beside the dog. "He's not just a comfort animal, he's trained to respond to nonverbal cues from children experiencing trauma, and he can detect emotional shifts, especially fear." Judge Harrow raised his eyebrows. "So, the girl's signal, what did it do?" "Doctor." Warner looked at Leela. "Do you mind if I ask Shadow to respond?" Again, no reply. But Leela raised her fingers to the side of her thigh and lightly curled them inward. Shadow stood instantly, eyes on Dr. Warner. The trainer smiled. "That's a focus signal," she explained. "It means he's being directed to identify the source of emotional threat or distress in the environment." The judge took a slow breath. So when she gave the first signal, Shadow zeroed in on the father, and when she gave the second, he confirmed the alert. "Doctor," Warner said, "the bark is his strongest warning. He's telling us that the source of distress is close and significant." Lila's mother clutched her hands together. "But how did she learn that? I never saw her do it before." "Doctor," Warner gently responded, "some trauma-focused therapists work with children using nonverbal techniques. When kids are too scared to speak, they build trust through animals. It's not uncommon for a child like Leela to be trained in safe cueing systems." Judge Harrow stepped away and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "So, the girl might not be speaking, but she is communicating through her dog." "Yes," Dr. Warner confirmed, very clearly. Suddenly, this wasn't just a custody case anymore. It was a possible trauma case, with a child using her dog as a voice. The legal implications were enormous. Could a dog's behavior be considered evidence? Could Lila's silent cues be accepted as a form of testimony? "I need to review this," the judge muttered, clearly troubled by the revelation. "I need the child's therapist brought in, and I want every prior report re-examined." As orders were made, Leela sat quietly, occasionally stroking Shadow's fur. Her mother leaned toward her, whispering, "You're so brave." Leela didn't respond, but she shifted slightly, allowing her mother's hand to rest beside hers. That small gesture meant everything. An hour later, Dr. Eleanor Ramirez, Lila's child therapist, arrived. She had been working with Leela for over 5 months, but had made very slow progress. Dr. Ramirez entered confidently, holding a binder thick with notes. She greeted Leela warmly and said to the room, Leila was taught specific hand signals to help her express distress. She and Shadow have trained together under supervision. What you saw in court today was a controlled expression of danger. It wasn't accidental or emotional outburst. She made a decision to tell you something the only way she could. Judge Harrow crossed his arms. What exactly has she been trying to say? Dr. Ramirez opened her binder and showed a diagram. She's never directly accused her father, but every time we spoke about home, her heart rate spiked when his name was mentioned. Shadow would sit in front of her protectively. When shown photos of different rooms in the father's house, she would give him the focus signal. Especially when we showed his study, she paused. That's why she was allowed to bring Shadow into court. We believed if she felt unsafe, he could help. But we didn't expect her to use him as a form of silent testimony. The judge took in the information slowly. This was no longer an emotional custody dispute. It was the unraveling of a hidden trauma. And the person who cracked it open wasn't a lawyer, a detective, or a doctor. It was a dog. Shadow rested again at Lila's feet, watching everyone, but perfectly calm now that his message had been received. Judge Harrow sighed and said, "We will continue tomorrow. But the court will no longer treat Leela as a passive witness. She has spoken, and we have to listen." As they left the room, the air felt different, thicker with understanding, sharper with possibility. The story was only beginning, but the court had already been changed forever by the silent strength of one little girl, and the dog who refused to let her voice go unheard. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. News had spread like wildfire: an emotionally scarred child, a trauma response dog, and a moment in court that no one could explain, but everyone wanted to understand. The media was buzzing with speculation. Was Lila's silence the loudest cry for help? Could a dog truly testify on behalf of a child? Judge Harrow ordered tight security and restricted media access. He didn't want a circus. He wanted the truth. Lila sat again in the courtroom, Shadow faithfully at her side. He looked relaxed, but anyone paying close attention could see his eyes flicking around the room, always assessing. He wasn't just a pet. He was a protector, on duty. This time, the judge didn't go through formalities. He looked directly at Lila and spoke with a gentleness he hadn't shown in his entire judicial career. "Lila," he said, "we know you've been through more than anyone should have to at your age. But we also know you're very brave. Yesterday, you helped us understand something important without saying a word. That took strength." Lila sat still, but there was something different about her posture. A calm resolve, like she knew things were finally shifting in her favor. Her father sat with tightened lips, trying to maintain composure, but his foot tapped anxiously, and his knuckles were white from gripping the table. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but he waved it away. His confidence was cracked, if not completely shattered. Dr. Eleanor Ramirez, Lila's therapist, was sworn in and began testifying. "I've worked with trauma victims for over a decade," she explained. "Lila is unique not because she's silent, but because she's smart. She knew people weren't listening to her words, so she found another way to communicate. That's what makes her powerful." She explained the training sessions, how Lila had been introduced to nonverbal dog commands as a safe outlet for stress, how Shadow had been taught to mirror her emotional state, and how they developed a bond built entirely on trust. "When she gives that hand signal," Dr. Ramirez said, "it isn't a trick. It's not rehearsed. It's her way of saying I don't feel safe," without being forced to relive her trauma. The father's lawyer stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. A dog cannot serve as a witness." The judge responded calmly, and yet the dog gave a response that led us to re-examine multiple oversight failures in child protective services. Proceed. Dr. Ramirez presented a series of drawings Lila had made in therapy. None showed faces. Most had dark corners, looming shadows, or large dogs standing between small girls and male figures. The judge studied them carefully. "Has Lila ever identified the source of her fear?" he asked. Dr. Ramirez paused, not in words, but consistently. When asked to draw where she felt afraid, she'd draw a room always the same one. "We now know it matches her father's study. She gives the distress signal every time she's reminded of that place." The judge leaned back. He looked at Lila, who was now gently running her fingers along Shadow's back. Her lips were pressed together, but her eyes weren't blank. They were watching, listening, waiting. Suddenly, the courtroom door opened. A bailiff entered, handing a folder to the judge. "Emergency file retrieval from CPS, Your Honor." The judge flipped through the pages quickly. His face changed, his brow furrowed. "This is from an unfiled 2020 medical visit," he said aloud. Lila was treated for a dislocated shoulder and bruises. Notes said she was clumsy. No further report filed. But look here, she wouldn't speak during that visit either. She flinched when touched by a male nurse. Gasps rose from several people in the courtroom. Lila's mother buried her face in her hands. Why was this never submitted into evidence? The judge asked angrily. Lila's father turned pale. His lawyer fumbled for an answer. "We weren't aware of that visit, Your Honor." "I'm beginning to think there's quite a bit you weren't aware of," Judge Harrow said coldly. He turned again to Lila. "Lila, would you like to say anything today for a moment?" "Nothing." Then Lila leaned slightly toward Shadow, gave the same hand signal from the day before, and then, softly, quietly, with her eyes still locked on her dog, she said, "He hurt me." The words were a whisper, but the silence that followed was deafening. The judge's gavel hit the desk immediately. That's enough for today. Court is adjourned until further notice. Lila was quickly escorted out, this time not needing to be led. She walked with Shadow beside her, more confident now. Her mother wrapped an arm around her, tears streaming. Judge Harrow stayed behind, looking down at the court transcripts, the medical files, the drawings, and now, the child's first spoken words in court. This case was no longer just about custody. It was about justice, and it was only just beginning. The courtroom had changed. What had begun as a routine custody case had evolved into something darker, more serious. The judge, the attorneys, even the spectators, everyone now saw Lila not as a passive, quiet child, but as a survivor. Her whispered words, "He hurt me," had silenced the room. Yet they rang loudly through every hallway of the courthouse. Judge Harrow met privately with representatives from Child Protective Services. The following morning, his tone was sharp, direct. "You missed this," he said, pointing to the medical records. "You left a child in danger." The CPS officer shifted uncomfortably. There were no formal complaints filed at the time, and she wouldn't speak. "We had nothing to pursue. She was 8. The judge snapped. "She had a dislocated shoulder. That is a complaint." He ordered a full internal review of Lila's case history. Files that had been overlooked or lost were to be re-examined. Within 48 hours, there was no room for error anymore. Meanwhile, Lila remained under protective custody in a trauma shelter with her mother and Shadow. The shelter was calm, painted in soft colors, full of therapy animals and staff trained to deal with children like her. She didn't talk much, but she began drawing again, this time with less darkness. One picture showed Shadow standing in front of a door. Behind the door was a figure drawn in red. "She's processing it now," Dr. Ramirez told the judge during a closed-door meeting. "She's no longer suppressing. That means she's moving toward healing." Judge Harrow nodded slowly. "And the father? He still denies everything." That afternoon, the courtroom reconvened, but this time under a veil of seriousness that hadn't been there before. The father was asked to take the stand not just as a parent seeking custody, but as a man under suspicion. His demeanor had changed. Gone was the confident, emotionless figure from earlier sessions. He looked tired now, nervous, with a sheen of sweat on his forehead. His lawyer had advised him to remain calm, but the pressure was building. "You've heard your daughter's words," the judge said. "You've seen the records. Do you have anything to say?" The father leaned into the microphone. "She's confused. She's been manipulated. Her mother is behind this," the courtroom murmured. Judge Harrow held up a hand to silence the room. "Did you injure your daughter during the 2022 incident?" the judge asked. "No," the father replied. "She fell off a chair. I was in the next room. She was bruised. Dislocated shoulder. Flinching from adult men. Do you really expect us to believe that? I never laid a hand on her." He insisted, louder this time. Just then, Dr. Warner, the canine expert, entered with updated notes on Shadow. She approached the bench and spoke in private with the judge. After a moment, he nodded and addressed the court. "We have reason to believe the child's trauma response dog may have detected consistent emotional distress patterns linked to the father. This will be allowed as part of the behavioral evidence." The father stood suddenly, clearly shaken. "This is insane. You're going to believe a dog over a man." Lila, sitting beside her mother, didn't flinch. Instead, she looked up and made another small hand signal to Shadow, one she hadn't used in court before. Shadow stood again, moved forward, slowly, and this time positioned himself directly between Lila and her father. His body was rigid, tail low, gaze steady. The courtroom didn't move. Dr. Warner spoke softly. "That's his shielding response. He's protecting her from a perceived threat." The father took a step back. It was the most damning gesture yet, not from Lila, not from a doctor, but from the dog, who had never once misread her emotional state. Judge Harrow leaned forward. "You may sit down, sir," as the father returned to his seat. The weight of Shadow's warning settled across the room. Later that day, a breakthrough came. CPS investigators uncovered an anonymous call from a neighbor. Nearly a year earlier, a report of loud yelling, a child crying, and a slammed door at the father's home. The report had been dismissed due to lack of visual confirmation. Now, it was being revisited. The neighbor, an elderly woman named Ms. Riley, agreed to testify. She entered the courtroom nervously, but determined. "I heard things," she told the judge, "things no one should ignore. That little girl was afraid. I could tell. I regret not pushing harder when no one believed me. Her voice cracked. Lila looked at Ms. Riley, then down at Shadow. She whispered again, just barely audible. She believed me. The judge exhaled slowly. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place not through dramatic testimonies or shocking videos, but through whispers, drawings, and the unwavering instinct of a dog. Outside, crowds had begun gathering. Protesters held signs calling for reform in child protection services. Media vans were parked in long rows. But inside, the only voices that mattered were now finally being heard. As court adjourned that evening, Judge Harrow gave strict orders. Protective custody would remain. Lila's father was now a person of interest, and full psychological evaluations were to be conducted, and privately, before leaving the bench. He said quietly to his clerk, "That little girl may have saved her own life, and that dog, he's not just evidence. He's a hero." The courthouse was quieter the next morning, not because there were fewer people, but because the weight of the case had grown heavier. Everyone walked softer, spoke lower, and watched Lila with a different kind of reverence. She was no longer just a little girl caught in the middle. She had become a symbol of courage, silence, survival, and of how a dog's loyalty could break through a courtroom skepticism. Shadow walked at her side as usual, but this time there was a different confidence in Lila's steps, small but noticeable. She no longer avoided the eyes of strangers. She didn't flinch when doors opened. Something inside her was beginning to thaw. Judge Harrow had called for an unscheduled hearing. He reviewed every document, every therapy note, and every page of the reopened CPS investigation. There was something about this case. He couldn't shake how many times the system had failed this child. He was determined to ensure it didn't fail her again. When the court came to order, he addressed the room differently than before. This case is no longer just about custody. He began, it has become a mirror reflecting the weaknesses of our child protection process, and perhaps more importantly, it has shown us that sometimes the most honest testimony doesn't come from a voice. It comes from behavior, emotion, and trust. He turned to the prosecution. "You may proceed." Lila's mother's attorney stood. "We would like to call Dr. Ramirez back to the stand, Your Honor." The therapist approached calmly, familiar with the courtroom now, and even more familiar with Lila's growing bravery. "Dr. Ramirez," the lawyer began, "has Lila ever disclosed details about her trauma?" "Yes," she replied, "not verbally, but through her drawings, gestures, and through Shadow." "Can you explain how the dog interprets Lila's emotional state?" Dr. Ramirez nodded. "Shadow is trained to identify shifts in her heart rate, breathing, and subtle signs of distress. When she's triggered, he reacts. He positions himself between her and the source. His growl or bark isn't random, it's a measured warning." "Would you consider his behavior in court reliable?" "Yes, and more consistent than most child testimonies under trauma." Lila's father stared straight ahead, unmoving, but his clenched fists and twitching jaw betrayed his anxiety. Next, the court allowed Ms. Riley, the neighbor, to return. With a formal, under oath statement, she recounted the many nights she'd heard Lila cry, the times she'd seen her return from visits with her father looking pale, quiet, and withdrawn. "Did you ever report it?" the judge asked. "I did," she replied. "I called the hotline once. They told me there wasn't enough to investigate, that it could have been anything." Her eyes filled with tears. "I knew something was wrong, but I didn't push hard enough." The room fell into a heavy silence. Lila's small voice cut through it once again. "You tried," she whispered. Everyone turned. Lila had spoken again, her third time in court. Shadow wagged his tail gently. Judge Harrow cleared his throat and looked at the defense. Would the father like to respond to these testimonies? The man stood, his face pale. He approached the stand like someone walking into his own storm. "I love my daughter," he said. "I still do. But she's being manipulated. That dog doesn't understand the difference between stress and lies." The judge leaned forward. "Are you saying the dog lied?" "No," the man snapped. "I'm saying she's using it to make me look like a monster." Before the judge could respond, Shadow stood again. No signal was given, no hand gesture. He simply stood, walked in front of Lila, and growled a low, warning sound. Dr. Warner quickly approached. "He's reacting to her emotional shift." No command was issued. Then what triggered him? The judge asked. She knelt beside the dog. Fear, pure and sudden fear. Lila was trembling. Shadow turned his body, facing the father, with a growl that became louder. "I think that's enough. Judge Harrow said sternly. The dog doesn't lie. The girl doesn't lie. The fear doesn't lie. The father was ordered to step back, and court security stood nearby. In the hallway after court, Leela sat in a quiet corner, hugging Shadow's neck. You knew. She whispered into his fur. You knew the whole time. Her mother sat beside her and gently stroked her back. You're safe now for the first time since the trial began. Leela nodded, a real, visible nod, not to a dog, not to a drawing, but to her mother, a silent gesture that said, I believe you too. That evening, Judge Harrow stayed late in his office, reading over child trauma laws, cross-referencing past court decisions, and reviewing Shadow's certification. The dog had performed his duty not just as a companion, but as a catalyst for truth. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. This case would set a precedent, not just for the law, but for every silent child waiting for anyone to hear what they could not say. 2 days later, the courtroom reopened for what was expected to be the most important session yet. News had reached national headlines. People weren't just following Lila's case anymore, they were rallying around her. Social media overflowed with support. Advocates for child abuse victims called her the girl who spoke through silence. Shadow, her loyal dog, was dubbed a hero in multiple newspapers. But inside the courtroom, the pressure was still immense. Judge Harrow had called the session to consider whether formal criminal charges should be filed against Lila's father. He had reviewed every report, therapy note, neighbor testimony, and Shadow certified behavioral reactions. This time, Lila entered the courtroom differently. She wasn't gripping a leash out of fear, she held it firmly, like a handle of strength. Shadow walked beside her, tail low and calm. The gallery watched in stillness, many with quiet admiration in their eyes. Dr. Ramirez sat behind Lila. Her presence was no longer just therapeutic, it was protective. The girl's mother held her breath as they passed the defense table. But Lila never looked in her father's direction. Judge Harrow began without preamble. Before this court moves to finalize custody and rule on criminal intent, we've allowed a final testimony request from the child's team. Lila's attorney stood. We'd like to allow Lila to communicate one last time in a way she's comfortable, not by force, not by trauma, but in her own way. The judge gave a nod. Permission granted. The courtroom held its breath. Lila stood slowly. She didn't climb onto the witness seat this time. Instead, she walked a few steps forward and turned to face the judge, Shadow at her side. Then she pulled a folded piece of paper from her small jacket pocket. It was a drawing. She walked to the bailiff and handed it to him. The bailiff passed it up to the judge, who unfolded it carefully. The room was silent as the judge examined it. His face softened. It showed a girl small, alone sitting on the floor of a dim room. Behind her, a shadowy figure towered with angry eyes. Between them stood a dog, drawn large and bold, facing the figure with a growl. The title in Lila's handwriting. He stood where I couldn't. The judge took a deep breath. Layla, may I ask you one thing? She looked up. Are you afraid now? She shook her head gently and looked down at Shadow. The judge smiled faintly. Then you've already won. The defense attorney, clearly shaken by the power of the moment, whispered urgently to Lila's father, who looked like a man sitting on a sinking ship. His hands trembled now. He leaned forward and whispered something to his lawyer, who stood and asked to approach the bench. After a brief hushed exchange with the judge, both attorneys returned to their seats. Judge Harrow addressed the courtroom again. The defendant wishes to make a statement. Lila's father stood slowly. Gone was the cold demeanor. In its place was a man unraveling. I didn't think I was hurting her. He began. I didn't hit her with fists, but I yelled. I slammed doors. I grabbed her when I lost patience. I made her afraid, and I let her think it was her fault. I didn't know. She was that scared. He paused and looked toward Lila, who didn't blink. I didn't mean to break her voice. Gasps echoed through the room. The words weren't enough, but they were a beginning. For the first time, the truth had been admitted. Judge Harrow leaned forward. So, you acknowledge the emotional and psychological abuse? The man nodded, barely able to speak. The judge turned to the court recorder. Let that be entered into the record. Lila didn't cry. She simply took a step back and rested, her hand on Shadow's back. He sat still and calm, soaking up her trembling strength. After a long pause, the judge addressed the courtroom. This court finds that the child's trauma, as evidenced through medical reports, behavioral signals, Therapeutic findings and today's emotional acknowledgement confirms a consistent pattern of emotional and psychological harm. He looked directly at Lila's father, effective immediately. Full and permanent custody is awarded to the child's mother. Supervised visitation is denied. Criminal investigations will proceed independently, and you are ordered to appear for psychological evaluation within 72 hours. He turned toward Lila and said gently, "This courtroom owes you more than we can express. You reminded us that not all truths are loud, and not all heroes stand on two legs." Shadow wagged his tail once. The gavel dropped. Case closed. Tears streamed silently down Lila's mother's face. Dr. Ramirez smiled softly, proud beyond words. Lila turned toward her mother and walked straight into her arms, hugging her tighter than ever before. But she didn't let go of the leash. She didn't need to anymore. Now, it was just part of her, like her voice, slowly returning. After being buried for so long, and outside the courtroom, the world waited not to judge her, but to celebrate her. The court ruling spread like wildfire. News stations ran continuous updates. Talk shows debated the implications. Advocates praised Judge Harrow's bold handling of a silent witness and a signal-speaking dog, but behind the public noise, a quieter story was unfolding, one filled with healing, change, and small victories that felt bigger than any headline. Lila and her mother returned home that evening to a house that had never truly felt like theirs. It was modest, quiet, and untouched by shadows. For the first time in years, it felt like a place to breathe. Shadow sniffed every room like a bodyguard on duty, then curled on the welcome mat near the kitchen. Dr. Ramirez visited the next day, not as a court-appointed therapist, but as someone who cared. Lila didn't speak. She didn't need to. But when her mother offered her oatmeal and Lila wrinkled her nose, they both burst into laughter. A sound her mother hadn't heard in over a year. That tiny moment made her tear up. Over the next week, small steps became milestones. Lila began to draw every day. Pictures of light and warmth. A dog guarding a castle. A mother and daughter flying kites. No more dark corners or shadowy figures. Dr. Ramirez encouraged her to use drawing as a form of storytelling. And slowly, a pattern formed. Lila didn't just draw what had happened. She began drawing what she wanted next. One evening, Lila's mother found her sitting at the table, sketching a group of children. They were sitting in a circle, laughing, with a dog in the middle wearing a superhero cape. At the top, she had written in careful block letters, "Shadow School." Her mother gently sat beside her. "What shadow school?" Lila pointed to the dog in the picture, then to herself, then to the circle of children. "You want to help other kids with shadow," her mother guessed. Lila nodded slowly. It was the first time she had shared a dream, and it gave her mother an idea. The following month, with the help of Dr. Ramirez and a few nonprofit supporters who had reached out after seeing the court case, they launched the Shadow Project, a weekend support group for trauma-affected kids centered around service dogs, art, and emotional recovery. The first session had only 5 children. By the third week, they had 17. Each child was paired with a therapy dog, and Lila, still quiet, still guarded, was present for every session. She didn't talk, but she sat beside each new child, shared crayons, and let them pet Shadow. Then came the breakthrough. A boy named Jonah, who hadn't spoken since witnessing a car accident that claimed his father's life, sat quietly beside Lila one afternoon. He wouldn't look at anyone, but Shadow padded over to him and gently nudged Jonah's arm. Lila took her notepad, scribbled something, and passed it to him. He read it, then looked at her. The note said, "He helped me talk inside my heart first." Jonah looked at Shadow again, then whispered under his breath, "Mine still." Quiet, Lila reached out and touched his hand. It was simple, but it meant everything. Word spread about the Shadow Project. Lila's story began appearing not just in court reports, but in educational seminars, therapy journals, and even a short documentary filmed by a college team that followed her progress with full consent. But the world wasn't what changed Lila. It was the slow, patient unfolding of her own courage. One sunny Saturday morning, she stood in front of the Shadow Project's newest group of kids and did something no one expected. She cleared her throat. The room fell still. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in over a year, she spoke just one sentence. "My name is Lila, and Shadow saved me." Her voice was raspy, barely louder than a whisper, but to those who knew her journey, It was the loudest, strongest sound they'd ever heard. Her mother wept silently in the back of the room. Dr. Ramirez clutched her own hands, trying not to cry, and Shadow, ever calm, simply sat by her side, tail sweeping gently across the floor. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees and Lila curled into bed, Shadow climbed up beside her. She hugged him tight and whispered, "I found my words again." And Shadow, though he didn't understand English, nuzzled her cheek with a deep, knowing sigh, because in his own way, he knew. The little girl who once needed a courtroom, a judge, a dog, and a drawing to be heard was finally ready to tell her own story, not through fear, not through silence, but with strength and voice. 1 year had passed since the court case that changed everything. It felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. Lila was no longer the silent little girl the world had met through a sketch and a service dog. She had grown not just taller, but stronger. Her voice, once buried beneath fear, now rose in short but clear sentences, delivered at her own pace. Sometimes she still struggled to speak in front of strangers, but that was okay, because now people listened when she did. The Shadow Project had expanded far beyond what anyone imagined. It was now a registered nonprofit with licensed therapists, volunteers, and therapy dogs across multiple cities. Lila and her mother remained at the heart of it. Dr. Ramirez had joined the board and helped design child-safe healing programs, and Shadow, he was now the face of the project, appearing on t-shirts, posters, and in storybooks used to help traumatized children all over the country. But to Lila, he was still just her best friend. On the anniversary of the court ruling, a special event was held in the same courthouse where it all began. This time, it wasn't about custody or conflict. It was a celebration, a tribute to courage, healing, and silent strength. The courtroom looked different now. It was filled with children, parents, dogs, and smiling faces. There were balloons, drawings pinned on display boards, and a small stage at the front where a banner read, "A Year of Voices." Judge Harrow, now retired, had returned for the ceremony. He looked more relaxed, but his eyes glistened with emotion when he spotted Lila. They shared a silent, momentary exchange of understanding that didn't need words. He stepped up to the podium and addressed the crowd. "A year ago, I witnessed something in this room that changed my life. A child who had been silenced by fear found a way to speak with a gesture. A dog responded. A courtroom paused, and justice finally listened. He paused and looked directly at Lila. She didn't speak to accuse. She didn't raise her voice to demand. She simply reached for help and taught the rest of us how to hear what wasn't being said." Applause filled the room. Lila's mother gently nudged her forward. Slowly, she walked onto the stage, Shadow beside her, wearing his trademark red vest. The audience quieted. Lila stood behind the mic, her heart thumped. But she wasn't afraid. She looked out at the children, the parents, the judge, and then down at Shadow. She smiled and finally spoke. "My name is Lila. I didn't talk for a long time because I was scared no one would believe me, but someone did. My dog did. Then others listened to." She took a breath. "That's why we started the Shadow Project, so kids like me don't have to scream or hide. They just need someone to look, someone to stay, someone to care." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "If you ever feel like no one hears you, find someone who listens without needing words." That's what Shadow did for me. The room erupted in gentle claps and cheers. Some people cried, others smiled through their tears. After the speech, Judge Harrow presented Lila with a certificate and a medal engraved with her name for courage and silence. Later that evening, as the event wound down and families took photos beside therapy dogs, Lila sat on the courthouse steps with her mother and Shadow. "Do you ever wish it never happened?" her mother asked gently, brushing a curl from Lila's forehead. Lila was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head. "I don't like what happened," she said, softly, "but I'm glad I found my voice." And Shadow, her mother kissed her forehead. "Me too, baby," behind them. A reporter snapped a photo Lila sitting between her mother and dog, framed by the warm evening sun. That image would soon appear on the cover of a national parenting magazine with the headline, "The Girl Who Taught the World to Listen." But for Lila, fame didn't matter. She wasn't trying to be a hero or a symbol. She just wanted to help. Weeks later, she visited a new Shadow Project branch in another city. A little girl there sat alone, holding tightly to a stuffed animal. She hadn't spoken in months. Her hands trembled. The counselors tried gently, but nothing seemed to reach her. Then Leela sat beside her and handed her a crayon and paper. She didn't say anything. She didn't push. She simply drew a dog with big ears and a red vest, then passed the paper over. The little girl stared at it, and slowly her hand reached for a crayon. That was all Leela needed, because she knew the first step wasn't always a sentence. It could be a look, a gesture, or a dog that wouldn't leave your side. As she walked away that day, holding Shadow's leash, she realized something simple and powerful. She was no longer the girl trying to be heard. She was the girl who helped others find their way out of silence, and that made all the difference.